Here we are for the second lecture from Chapter 11. We will be talking today about personality theory as it relates to behaviorism and cognitive behaviorism, humanism, and biological theory. So, we begin with behaviorism. Following psychoanalysis, behaviorism was the next theory chronologically, and it is arguably the most important theory in psychology. Now, when I say the most important theory, I don't necessarily mean that everyone in psychology believes it more than any other theory or anything of that sort. What I mean is, behaviorism has had a greater influence on psychology than any other theory. The first, let's just remember the first two basic premises of behaviorism. Number one, observable behavior. That's the only thing you trust. A behaviorist may very well agree with you that there's an unconscious mind, may believe in it, but because there's no physical evidence of an unconscious mind, the behaviorist will not trust behaviorism. That's the first premise, is that you only go by what you can see, what you can observe. And that's behavior. The second basic principle of behaviorism is that we are formed. Remember, this chapter is all about personality theory. And personality theory is about what makes us who we are. And the behaviorists believe that what makes us who we are is very simply the environmental influences in our world. The stimuli that we receive, the associations we make between stimuli, the reinforcements or the punishments we have received in our everyday life. These are the basic premises of behaviorism. Now, the two best-known behaviorists, Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Now, Pavlov was not even a psychologist, and he actually is credited with the single most important theory in psychology. So, Pavlov in 1906-1907 in Russia was a physiologist, so he was studying the function of the body. He was studying digestion. And in his study of digestion, he used dogs. Labs, actually. And he came up with a couple of basic ideas that revolutionized behavior, that revolutionized psychology. Now, his theory did never lend itself well to personality development. All it lended itself to was change and the assumption of new behaviors. But one who followed him very shortly after was B.F. Skinner. He wrote his doctoral dissertation in 1915. The original classical conditioning that Pavlov came up with was contrasted by B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Skinner, it's very, very simple. It's very simple in theory. In practice, there are many, many variables associated with how Skinner presented his ideas. But very, very simply, Skinner believed that we become who we become by the reinforcements and the punishments of our environment. And when we talk about punishments, we're not talking about severe, nasty treatment. What we're talking about is a child behaving in a certain way and a parent saying, "Oh, no, we don't do that." That's a correction. That's considered a punishment. A reinforcement, on the other hand, is when a child does what you want them to do, and the parent says, "Oh, that was wonderful." And so that's a reinforcement. The punishments and the reinforcements of our life are what B.F. Skinner believed created a person's personality. That repetitive process over and over and over and over again is what led us to become whom we become. Not a bad idea. He talks about, well, many terms that we will discuss in chapter 6 in much more detail. But if it's used carefully, Skinner's operant conditioning can lead to a great deal of clear evidence of behavioral patterns, and then behavioral patterns that turn into very permanent and deeply ingrained personality traits. Now, that's as simple as the concept is in reference to the creation of personality. There were a number of cognitive theorists. Walter Mischel and Julian Roeder, they led to some pretty interesting ideas, but never enough to fully capture a full personality theory where the concepts that were considered could come together to create a full personality structure. But they led the way for Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura created a theory that included both cognitive and behavioral principles. Now, you remember, cognitive theory is the idea that our beliefs are what literally are the source of both our emotions and our behavior. And so, actually, cognitive and behavioral theory come together quite well. We don't even refer to cognitive theory alone anymore, or behavioral theory alone anymore. We refer to cognitive behavioral theory because they got married. And it's not a bad marriage. They're very different in very many ways, but they come together quite well, understanding the concept that both behavior and thought are inseparably connected. Bandura came up with his theory of observational learning. Now, observational learning came out of a larger concept of what was called social learning theory, the idea that our society around us is what reinforces or corrects us, and just by living in a society, that natural process is what causes us to become whom we become. Well, Bandura took some of those ideas and came up with observational learning. Bandura's observational learning requires three things. It requires a model. That means someone who's exhibiting a behavior. It requires a behavior, that which the model is exhibiting. And then number three, it requires an observer, or the learner. Therefore, the model exhibits the behavior, the learner observes the behavior exhibited by the model. Bandura's theory actually has four basic steps. The first step is attention, meaning that the observer where the learner has to attend to the behavior of the model for any of this to work. If there's no attention, then there's no learning. The second principle is retention. That means that the observer, the learner, has to remember what was attended to in the model's behavior. Now, those first two principles are cognitive principles. Attention is an internal process, it's cognitive. And retention is memory, which of course is an internal process. That's a cognitive process. So steps 1 and 2 are cognitive principles. Steps 3 and 4 are behavioral principles. The first behavioral principle, and this is very important for you to understand, that there is a division between the cognitivists and the behaviorists. The cognitivists believe that you can learn something without ever exhibiting the behavior. You can observe it, you can learn it, you can attend to it, you can remember it, and it can be there waiting for a time when you need it. The behaviorist, though, only believes in observable behavior. You remember I said that. Therefore, the behaviorist says something is not completely learned until the behavior is actually exhibited. So this is where the cognitivists and the behaviorists divide when it comes to learning. The behaviorist always says the behavior has to be exhibited. And in Bandura's theory, step 3 is reproduction, meaning the reproducing of the behavior of the model. And many of you would think, well, that's all you need. Now the behavior's been reproduced and it's been all learned. Well, most of us understand that especially complex behaviors, they have to be repeated many, many times for it to actually be fully learned. And to be repeated many, many times, there is need for motivation. And if you think about what motivation is in a Skinner's theory idea, that means that what you do is reinforcing to you. So that reinforcement provides motivation. And so therefore, again, it's a behavioral principle coming from Skinner's ideas. So attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Those are your 4 basic principles of observational learning. And this is the idea that we use to suggest that personality can be developed through this observational learning. As a parent, I always love it when children exhibit the behaviors of mine that I like them to exhibit. I am not real pleased when they exhibit the behaviors of mine that I'm not real pleased with, but that is how that learning occurs. It's observed, it's attended to, remembered, reproduced, and hopefully it's motivating. Now, I don't know about you folks, but there have been a lot of things that I've reproduced, a lot of behaviors I've done, and after I did them, I said, I don't ever want to do that again. And so just because you do a behavior doesn't mean you necessarily learn it and have it become part of your personality. It has to be a repeated, motivated behavioral pattern that then becomes included in an integral aspect of your personality. And that's how personality character traits grow on top of one another through that learning process, according to Bandura. Now, those are the basic principles behind behavioral theory when it comes to personality development. Now, the next theory, you remember I told you back, at least 2 lectures ago, about the big 3. What are the big 3 theories? Psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and in this case, cognitive behaviorism, and humanism. So humanism is the next theory that we approach. This is a school of psychology, of course, and there are 2 major theories within humanism for the creation of personality. These are Carl Rogers and his person-centered theory, and Abraham Maslow And many of you have heard of Maslow. This has to do with his pyramid of needs. And we will talk about both of these principles. So, in psychology, Carl Rogers is the single most important humanist in psychological process. He has had a powerful influence on psychology in general, and most importantly, on psychotherapy in general. Pretty much every psychotherapist has learned Rogerian psychotherapy because it's just a foundational element of doing good psychotherapy. Carl Rogers started his theory in the 1950s and well into the 60s. He first called his theory client-centered theory, but then he decided that clients were more than just clients, they were people too. And so he eventually referred to it as person-centered theory. Now remember, this is a humanistic theory. And what are the two basic principles of humanism? Now I told you those before, but let's review them. Number one, the core of every human being is good. Now that means there's goodness way down deep there in some people, but they're covered up with layer after layer after layer after layer after layer of junk from the world. And according to humanistic theory, you can slowly pull those layers off through a process and eventually get down to that true self. And if you do, you find that core of goodness. That's principle number one. Number two is free will or choice, that we actually possess free will. Now, there are many people in this world who perhaps believe that they don't possess free will. They feel forced and pushed and controlled, and they may very well feel that way. But humanistic theory says you don't have to. You can learn how you have free will and choice. Carl Rogers believes in a basic principle called the self. The self is who we perceive ourselves to be. Sometimes that self is congruent or fits with reality. Sometimes it does not fit with reality. And so he uses this concept of congruence and incongruence to help us come to understand how we can learn choice or free will. Now, what is congruence? I talked to you about this before. You know, the idea that our cognitive part, our emotional part, and our behavioral part aren't always agreeing with each other. Sometimes we do things because we believe we should, and we're emotionally motivated to do it, but our behavior just doesn't come along, or some other mixture of not agreeing with each other or not being congruent with each other. Congruence doesn't mean that two things are the same. It simply means they fit together. It's like height and shoe size. Usually people who are tall got big feet. Usually people who are short got small feet. Every once in a while there's an exception, but the bottom line is they're congruent. One doesn't cause the other, but they fit together. Well, when parts of us feel incongruent, Carl Rogers believes that's what motivates us to go within ourselves and try to find aspects of us that will help us resolve that incongruence. Congruence and incongruence is like well, have you ever heard of the story of Aesop's fable called The Fox and the Grapes? The story is that the fox is walking down the path and he is hungry, he's famished, he needs food. And he comes up upon a bunch of grapes that's hanging down from a grapevine. And he decides that he needs those grapes and that those grapes are his. And so he walks up to them and he jumps with all his power and he just misses the grapes. But they're still his grapes. And so he backs up a little bit and he takes a little bit of a running start and he leaps and he gets closer but just barely misses them again. Then he finally says, I have got to have these grapes. And so he backs way up and takes a big running start and leaps with every bit of strength he's got. And he reaches up and he just barely misses the grapes. Now, the fox is at a point of incongruence in that moment. He believes the grapes are his. He wants them dearly, his emotions, but his behavior isn't fitting with the other two. And so he is in a state of incongruence. Now, he has two opportunities. He can either grieve the loss or he can lie to himself. Well, if he grieves the loss, then he says, well, I guess what I believed wasn't true and what I wanted wasn't possible because I couldn't do it. So I just move along now and I'll find food somewhere else. Or he can lie to himself and do what we often do and say, well, they were probably sour grapes anyway. And that's what Aesop said he did. He said they were sour grapes anyway. And that's where the term sour grapes comes from. Well, they really weren't sour grapes. Just a few minutes before, he thought they were the greatest things in the world. But now, because he can't get them, all of a sudden they're sour grapes. So he just lied to himself to try to settle down his feeling of incongruence. Well, we human beings often feel incongruent, and it motivates us to either lie to ourselves or do some work. And that's what Carl Rogers believes creates personality, is that incongruence within us motivates us to do work. And that motivation helps us learn the pieces that add to us piece by piece by piece and build our personality over the course of time. It's an interesting theory. We'll talk more about Carl Rogers in chapter 14, or 15, when we talk about different methods of psychotherapy. But now we're going to talk a little bit about Abraham Maslow. And as I show you this, you're going to realize you've probably seen this before. So, Abraham Maslow had a pyramid. He called it his pyramid of needs. In your book, it shows a pyramid of 7 different levels. Now, that's an interesting concept, but it's not necessarily where we're going. Abraham Maslow believed that we have different levels of needs that we grow through, that each lower need must be satisfied before we are able to move up towards the next higher level of needs, and that our progression and therefore our personality grows as we build upon these different levels of need. As I said, what you have in the book is 7 levels. Well, when he started his career, he first came up with 5 levels. Then, as his career moved along, he divided 2 of those levels and created 2 more levels, ending up with 7. But then toward the end of his career, he decided that the original 5 were the ones that were best representative of things. Now remember, each one of these levels must be met before you can move on to master or work on the next level of needs. And where a person is at, on which level they are on, is what motivates their behavior at that point in time. So, the bottom need is physical needs. The second need up is safety needs. The third need up we'll call belonging. It actually means they're social or interpersonal needs. The fourth level up is the need for achievement. And the fifth level, the top level, self-actualization. So if we were in real class, I'd be putting this up on a board. And I really miss being in the real class with you guys. We'd have a whole lot more fun. We'd be joking around and playing off each other and just having a great time. But we can't right now. I wish we could. But here's what we've got. So, his pyramid of needs looks like this. First, we start at the physical level. What do we mean by physical level? We mean food, water, shelter, clothing, warmth, those basic physical needs that people have and should have be met. Everyone should have those needs met as a child. Recognize you living in this country are more likely to have those needs met than any other place in the world. So be grateful for that. Once those physical needs are met, they don't have to be met again. So when we talk about Viktor Frankl being in Auschwitz and Dachau, he would talk about how people would give the crust of their bread, even though they were starving, to someone else who was starving more than them. Well, why would they do that? Their physical needs were not being met by giving away the crust of their bread, and yet they did. So why would that make a difference? Why would someone do that? Well, it means that that person is motivated by a higher need. That the physical need is no longer motivating their behavior. And the idea is once those physical needs have truly been met and a person really knows what that's like, then they don't have to depend on being motivated by those physical needs. Then they move to the next level. And the next level is safety. How many children in this world are living in situations that are not safe? Well, the most dangerous area of the world over the last 10 years for children has been the Darfur region of Africa. And this is where children are abducted, killed, abused, etc. It's a horrible place. Can you imagine what those children feel like when they consider what is of value to them? Well, probably safety and constantly looking for safety. But think of many of you in your homes where you experience that safety. But also recognize that there are a lot of people in this world who experience trauma. And when they experience trauma, their sense of safety is compromised. And so they may not feel that sense of safety. But once those safety needs are met, then what motivates us is to belong, to be part of a social system. Now, shouldn't everyone be part of that belonging process, be part of that social system in their home? Wouldn't that be ideal? Wouldn't that be the best option? Well, it should be, but many times it's not. Hopefully for you, it was. But if it wasn't, recognize that some people may be highly motivated by that need to believe, need to belong. Perhaps you know someone in your group of friends who is always hoping to belong. Well, perhaps that's where their motivation is coming from. That's where their development is at right now. Now, once we have achieved that sense of believing, we move on to achievement. That sense of achievement is about leaving something behind, creating a legacy for oneself, being able to say, I did this and I made it work. It's a very powerful concept, really, if you think about it. To be able to say you made a difference in the world. And that's what achievement is all about. There are a lot of people who work very, very hard and look like they're achieving, but they're really not motivated by their achievement. They're working all the time in order to belong. But do you recognize that you can never belong in a social system by simply trying to work and achieve? You can't belong by achieving. Therefore, someone is at too high a level and they're trying to satisfy a lower level's need, but you can't from a higher level. And you're not going to achieve that higher level either because you haven't settled on that lower level either. To belong, you have to belong. And that means you have to open your heart interpersonally and socially to do that. Then you can move on to achievement for the purpose of achieving, for the purpose of making your mark on the world, for the purpose of making a difference. That's what achievement is truly about. Now, I don't think Bill Gates has always been the most positively motivated human being in this world. There are a lot of people who would say that he ransacked other companies that he acquired and to try to make Microsoft remain at the top of the ladder, if you will. But he seems to have grown into something very different now. He certainly has achieved. He has so much stock in Microsoft that the man cannot make enough money. He's trying as hard as he possibly can to give away his money. And he keeps earning more and more and more money the more and more he gives it away. Yeah, he's not the richest guy, but he's one of the top 5. And if he wasn't giving all his money away, he'd be the richest guy in the world. But he and his wife keep trying to give that money away to good causes. Were you aware that they had set up 9 different hospitals to try to treat coronavirus patients and to specifically work on the coronavirus vaccine? 9 different hospitals have they created, built, in order to try 9 different angles of the coronavirus vaccine idea. And he's funding it all. I just think it's funny that the more he tries to give away his money, the more money he makes. Maybe he should have been trying to give away his money all along. But that leads us from that point of achievement to the highest level on Maslow's hierarchy, which is self-actualization. Now, I don't know if Bill Gates is self-actualized, but self-actualization means that a person has achieved their full potential. Now, we can pretty well say that pretty much nobody is ever going to achieve their full potential. There's always going to be something more that we can do to do that. Abraham Maslow said that he only knew 2 people who he thought were pretty close to it. One was a colleague of his, and the other, one of his sons. He felt they'd probably come closer to self-actualization than anyone else he'd ever met. Did a pretty good job of explaining that. But likely no one has ever become fully and absolutely self-actualized. Well, this is the idea of how Abraham Maslow says personality is grown. We start meeting our physical needs, and then as we move up from one level to the next, we create greater and greater pieces that get added on to us. And we more fully and more fully and more fully develop who we are as we pursue this innate need and desire to move on to the next level. And he believes that everyone is motivated this way from the inside out. And so, as you can see, humanism, very rational, right? Because it's all about internal processes. Okay. Well, there's humanism. And its explanation of how personality is developed. Then finally, we have biological theory. Now, biological theory, in its explanation, is extremely simplistic, much like behaviorism. Different in many ways, though, of course. But biological theory says our biological selves are the greatest reason why we are who we are. In other words, our DNA is the greatest defining factor of who we are. Psychology these days, especially in research, is finding greater and greater evidence of biological theory carrying a lot of weight. And yet, there are some great combinations of theories. So, for example, the combination of environmental influences in behavioral theory combining with the genetic influences of biological theory. Now, think about it. Does biological theory explain everything? Well, clearly it does not, simply because two identical twins who have the exact same genetic makeup, one can become schizophrenic and the other does not. So if we are completely biological beings and we are determined, this is another deterministic theory, right? We are determined by our genetics, by our DNA, then by rights, both should have become schizophrenic. But if only one does, then clearly there is something more at play. But the idea of biological theory says the most important aspect of who we become is that genetic makeup. Now, I used this example with you before. Biological theory does have good evidence that says no matter how hard we try to choose certain things, there are some aspects of ourselves that our biological makeup determines who we are. As I said, on either the 13th or 23rd pair of chromosomes, if you have an extra half a chromosome attached, you have Down syndrome. Well, all the proactive choice and humanistic belief in free will is not going to assist that person to make it to a college level learning system. In fact, they won't. They won't get there. Because clearly our biological self has placed a ceiling on certain abilities. That doesn't diminish or change any individual's value, not in the slightest. What it does do is at times it determines who we are. Now, Hans Eysenck was a theorist starting in the early to mid 1950s, who believed that genetics was the biggest variable in determining who we become. And he did a great deal of research with identical twins, specifically on the personality characteristic of introversion versus extroversion. And he worked with identical twins who were raised together, identical twins who were raised apart, non-identical twins, in this case, from separate ovum, of course, and then just siblings. And if you look at this very carefully, you'll find that there are some very, very interesting pieces of data. For example, with intelligence, intellectual level. Identical twins who are raised together, they tend to measure out at a correlation coefficient of somewhere between 0.9 and 0.95. 1.0 is perfect correlation, meaning perfectly similar. And that's pretty close. That their intellectual levels, measures of IQ, are that close. If they're raised apart, it's between 0.85 and 0.9. If you have non-identical twins, this is very interesting. They are raised together, but they have different genetic makeup. Non-identical twins have a similarity of IQ scores at about 0.65. And then siblings, just siblings raised in the same home, is about 0.60. So clearly, with the aspect of intelligence, when we look at identical twins, there's clearly a very powerful genetic aspect to intellectual functioning, either raised together or apart. A little bit different there, but not that different. Certainly much different than between them and non-identical twins or siblings. What Eysenck found out is that identical twins are highly similar in their either introversion or extroversion tendencies, whether raised together or apart. So that seems to be a personality characteristic that appears to be governed to a great extent, according to his old research, by genetic factors. And there are many genetic factors that we really can't argue with. We really can't step away from them as important variable factors. There are other biological theories that your book talks about. Buss was a theorist who discussed other kinds of evolutionary kind of aspects to biological personality theory and some others in the book. But really the main character that we're focusing on is Eysenck. Now again, there are others. And remember, I'm going to talk about the major points, the points with quizzes that are most likely to be represented on a quiz. But that doesn't mean that some of the other information in the book is not going to be represented on a test. Not nearly as much as the things that we've covered together. As I mentioned to you in my email to y'all today, I'm close to getting figured out the whole quiz situation, and hopefully we'll be able to resolve that quickly. And as I said to you, I'm quite the the technological neophyte. That's just not an area of my strength, but I'm working hard at it and hope to be able to get that ready for you for in the next week or so to start taking quizzes. Again, the quizzes aren't going to be long. They'll only be about 20 items for each quiz. And that means 20 items per chapter. And I will try to make sure that the larger concepts that we have covered in our lectures are more likely represented than other lesser concepts on the quizzes. So remember, for Chapter 11, you're going to have your one-page paper and your discussion posts and discussion responses. Please do them. I want to give you points. I'm trying as much as I can to create as many easy points as I possibly can for you to be able to gather points for your final grade. So please do your best and just get these darn things done. And remember also, I'm trying to help you build your research paper. It's going to be due in about 4 weeks. So this week, I'm wanting you to put together your reference page, your sources that you've found, and put that into a reference page in American Psychological Association format. All you have to do is look at the back of your book in the references that your book has, and it will give you a perfect example. Just looking through those reference pages in the back of your book of how to put together a reference page. Okay. Well, that's about it for today. I have also begun to think about the idea of potentially on a Saturday morning doing Saturday morning, maybe 3-4 times in the quarter, doing a Zoom chat so that you can ask questions. You might want to let me know whether or not that's something you'd like to do. I'm willing to give that a try. So let me know. And beyond that, that's the end of today's lecture. Good luck, and I look forward to reading your one-page papers and your discussion posts and responses. All right. We'll talk to you. We'll also have one more lecture this week. It'll be Friday, and that will be the first lecture from Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about research, so that'll be the next area we're diving into. So we're compacting into 4 days, Chapter 11. And we'll be beginning Chapter 2 lecture on Friday, but you won't have anything due until next week from Chapter 2. So we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye now.